A test of character, a widow's secret, a wealthy man's disguise when cattle baron James Ashford arrives at Clara Hastings' door pretending to be a penniless drifter. He expects to expose her greed. Instead, he discovers something that will shatter everything he thought he knew about honor. The widow answered on the third knock, flour dusting her hands and a wariness in her eyes that James Ashford recognized immediately. It was the look of someone who'd learned that strangers rarely brought good news. He stood on her porch in clothes he'd borrowed from his own ranch hand, hat worn thin at the brim, boots scuffed beyond recognition. Every inch of him screamed poverty, and that was exactly the point. "Help you?" Clara Hastings asked, wiping her hands on her apron. She was younger than he'd expected, maybe 30 at most, with dark hair pulled back severe and practical. Pretty in a way that hard work hadn't quite managed to erase, though it had certainly tried. James cleared his throat and let his shoulders slump in a way that felt foreign to a man who'd spent 20 years standing tall. "Ma'am, I'm sorry to trouble you, but I've been walking since dawn and I wondered if you might have any work needs doing. I can split wood, mend fences, tend animals, whatever you need. I don't ask much. Just a meal and maybe a place to sleep that ain't the cold ground." Clara's eyes moved over him slowly, assessing. James felt the weight of her judgment and had to resist the urge to stand straighter. He was James Ashford, owner of the largest cattle operation in 3 territories, and he'd never begged for anything in his life. But his lawyer had insisted, and the stakes were too high to let pride get in the way. "You got a name?" Clara asked. "Jim," he said quickly. "Jim Cooper." The lie tasted bitter, but he forced his expression to remain neutral and humble. Clara studied him a moment longer, then stepped back from the door. "I got fence posts that need setting before winter really sets in. You do that proper and I'll feed you supper. There's a shed out back with some old blankets if you prove you're worth trusting for the night." Relief flooded through James, though he kept it hidden. "Thank you, ma'am, you won't regret it." "I better not," Clara said flatly. "Tools are in the barn. Posts need to go along the eastern pasture. You'll see where the old ones rotted through." James nodded and turned toward the barn, feeling her eyes on his back until he rounded the corner of the house. Only then did he allow himself a grim smile. Phase 1 complete. Now came the real test. The fence work was harder than James had anticipated. Not because he didn't know how to do it. He'd built half his empire with his own 2 hands before he could afford to pay men to do it for him. But because he'd forgotten what it felt like to work without the buffer of wealth. His hands blistered within the first hour. His back ached by the second. And when he finally drove the last post into the half-frozen ground, the sun was already sinking toward the horizon and his whole body screamed for rest. He returned to the house as twilight painted the sky purple and gold. Clara was on the porch, hanging laundry that snapped in the cold wind. She glanced at him, then at the distant fence line. "You actually finished," she said, and there was something like surprise in her voice. "Said I would, ma'am." Clara nodded slowly, gathering the last of the laundry into her basket. "Wash up at the pump. Supper's almost ready." The water from the pump was ice cold and made James gasp as he scrubbed the dirt and sweat from his face and hands. Through the window, he could see Clara moving around her small kitchen, and he took the opportunity to really look at the property. The house was small but well maintained, the kind of place that spoke of constant effort against constant decay. The barn leaned slightly to the left, propped up by new lumber that didn't quite match the old. The garden was covered for winter, but he could see where someone had carefully planned each row for maximum yield. This was a woman barely holding on, and James knew it. His lawyer had painted her as a gold digger, a woman who'd married his late uncle for money, and was now sitting pretty on an inheritance she didn't deserve. But standing here in the fading light, looking at a property that showed every sign of desperate maintenance and careful poverty, James felt the first whisper of doubt. Inside, the house smelled like bread and stewed meat. Clara had set 2 places at a small wooden table, and James felt a strange pang seeing how carefully she'd arranged everything. 2 plates, 2 cups, 2 forks. Like company was something rare enough to warrant ceremony. "Sit," Clara said, bringing a pot to the table. "It's not much, but it's hot." James sat and watched as she ladled stew into his bowl. The portions were generous, more generous than he'd expected given the obvious state of her finances. When she served herself, he noticed her portion was considerably smaller. "This looks wonderful, ma'am," James said carefully. "You didn't have to go to such trouble." "A working man needs fuel," Clara replied, sitting across from him. "And it's Clara, no need for ma'am." They ate in silence for a while. The stew was simple but good, and James found himself genuinely hungry after the day's labor. He watched Clara between bites, noting the way she ate slowly, deliberately, like someone making a small amount of food last as long as possible. "You run this place alone?" James asked finally, breaking the quiet. Clara's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I do now." "Husband pass?" "Year and a half ago." Her tone made it clear the subject wasn't open for discussion. James nodded and returned to his stew. The silence stretched between them again, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people too tired to fill the air with meaningless words. When the meal was finished, Clara stood and began collecting the dishes. James rose to help, but she waved him off. "You worked hard today. Shed's out back like I said. There's blankets and it's dry at least." "Thank you, Clara." James hesitated at the door. "I appreciate the kindness." Something flickered across Clara's face, surprise maybe, or suspicion that someone would call basic decency kindness. "Locks broken on the shed door," she said instead of responding to his gratitude, "but nothing in there worth stealing anyway." James stepped out into the cold night and made his way to the shed. It was small and drafty, but true to her word, there were blankets and it was dry. He settled onto a pile of hay bales and stared up at the dark ceiling, thinking about the woman in the house and the test he was supposed to be conducting. His uncle, William Ashford, had died 18 months ago and left his entire estate, a considerable sum, to his widow Clara. James's lawyer had been immediately suspicious. William had been 73 when he died, Clara barely 28 when they married. The math alone suggested something unseemly, and the lawyer had urged James to investigate before accepting the will's terms. "She's after the family money," the lawyer had insisted. "Women like that always are. Find proof she married him for his fortune and we can contest the will. Everything comes back to you as the rightful heir." So James had come up with this plan. Disguise himself as a poor drifter, get close to Clara, and wait for her to reveal her true nature. A woman who'd married for money would surely show her greed eventually. She'd mention her late husband's wealth, or complain about her reduced circumstances, or perhaps even try to seduce another man she thought might have prospects. But lying in the dark shed, his muscles aching from honest work, James found himself doubting the entire premise. The woman who'd fed him tonight wasn't living like someone sitting on a fortune, and the way she'd given him the larger portion of stew, even when she clearly had little enough for herself, that wasn't the behavior of a greedy woman. Sleep came slowly, and when it did, James dreamed of his uncle's face and the last conversation they'd had before William had moved out to this remote property. "I'm done with the big ranch, James," William had said. "Done with the politics and the posturing. I want simple. I want honest. I want to spend my last years with someone who sees me, not my bank account." James had thought his uncle was being a fool. Now, lying in Clara's shed, he wondered if perhaps William had been the wisest man he'd ever known. Morning came cold and gray. James woke to the sound of an axe biting into wood, steady, rhythmic, and close. He pushed himself up from the hay bales, every muscle in his body protesting yesterday's labor, and stepped out into the pre-dawn light. Clara was at the woodpile, splitting logs with an efficiency that spoke of long practice. She'd already built a considerable stack, and as James watched, she set up another log and brought the axe down with a crack that echoed across the empty fields. "Morning," James called out, not wanting to startle her. Clara turned, lowering the axe. There was sweat on her forehead despite the cold, and her breath came out in white clouds. "Morning. There's coffee on the stove if you want it. Help yourself." James headed into the house, noting that Clara didn't follow. The kitchen was warm from the stove, and true to her word, there was a pot of coffee sitting on the heat. He poured himself a cup and stood at the window, watching Clara work. She moved like someone who'd been splitting wood her entire life, but James could see the strain in her shoulders, the way she had to use her whole body to generate enough force. This wasn't easy work for her, but she did it anyway because it needed doing and there was no one else to do it. When Clara finally came inside, her face was flushed and her hands were trembling slightly. She poured herself coffee and leaned against the counter, eyes closed. "You all right?" James asked before he could stop himself. Clara's eyes opened. "Fine, just getting a late start today. Usually have this done before sunup." "You do this every morning." "Wood doesn't split itself." Clara sipped her coffee, studying him over the rim of her cup. "You planning to move on today, or you looking for more work?" James hadn't actually thought that far ahead. His plan had been to stay a few days at most, long enough to get a sense of Clara's character. But something about the way she stood there, exhausted and proud and holding herself together through sheer will, made him hesitate. "I could stay on a bit longer if you've got work that needs doing," he heard himself say. "Looks like you could use an extra set of hands around here." Clara's expression was unreadable. "I can't pay you anything beyond meals and the shed." "That's fine. And I don't know how long I can even keep that up," Clara continued, her voice harder now. "So don't get comfortable. When the food runs out, you'll have to move on whether the work's done or not." James nodded slowly, understanding dawning. She wasn't just poor, she was nearly destitute. "I understand." "Good," Clara set down her cup. "Barn roof's got a leak needs patching. You know anything about roofing?" "Some." "Then that's your job today. Materials are limited, so make them count." James spent the morning on the barn roof, patching holes with scraps of wood and tar that had clearly been salvaged and reused multiple times. From his elevated position, he could see the full scope of Clara's property, and what he saw troubled him deeply. The fields were empty of livestock except for 2 aging cows and a handful of chickens. The fences he'd repaired yesterday were just one section of a perimeter that was failing in a dozen other places. The house itself, which had looked decent enough from the front, showed serious problems from above: missing shingles, a chimney that leaned dangerously, windows covered with oiled paper instead of glass. This wasn't the home of a woman hoarding wealth. This was the home of someone drowning slowly and trying desperately not to let anyone see her go under. Around noon, James climbed down from the roof to find Clara in the garden, digging up root vegetables. She had a basket beside her, but it was filling slowly, and James could see her face was tight with worry. "How's the roof?" she asked without looking up. "Patched, should hold through winter, but it'll need proper repairs come spring." Clara nodded, still focused on her digging. "Everything needs proper repairs come spring. Spring's a long way off, though." James crouched down beside her, ignoring the protest from his aching knees. "Clara, can I ask you something?" She finally looked at him, suspicious. "Depends on the question." "Your husband, when he passed, did he leave you provided for?" Clara's face went very still. For a moment, James thought she might tell him to mind his own business and throw him off her property. Instead, she sat back on her heels and let out a long, slow breath. "You're asking if I'm sitting on money while living like this," she said flatly. "I'm asking if you need help that you're too proud to ask for." Clara studied him for a long moment, and James had the uncomfortable sensation of being seen through, like she was looking past his disguise to something deeper. Finally, she turned back to her digging. "William left me everything," she said quietly. "The house, the land, some money. It was generous, more generous than I deserved for a marriage that barely lasted 2 years." She pulled up a potato and brushed dirt from it with practiced motions. "But there were debts I didn't know about. Medical bills from before we met. Bad investments he'd made trying to build this place up. By the time everything was settled, there wasn't much left." James felt something cold settle in his chest. How much is not much? "Enough to get through winter if I'm careful. If nothing breaks, if nobody gets sick, if the cows keep giving milk." Clara's laugh was bitter. "So not enough at all, really. Come spring, I'll likely have to sell and move on. Find work in town somewhere." "There must be family." "There isn't." Clara's voice was sharp now. "And even if there was, I'm not asking for handouts. I'll make it work. I always do." James watched Clara return to her digging with a ferocity that made it clear the conversation was over. He stood slowly, his mind racing. Everything his lawyer had told him, every assumption he'd made about this woman, all of it was crumbling like dry earth. This wasn't a gold digger living off his uncle's fortune. This was a woman fighting for survival with nothing but determination and pride. He spent the rest of the afternoon reinforcing the barn door, which hung crooked on rusted hinges. The work was meditative, giving him time to think. His Uncle William had been a complicated man, stern and practical, but with a soft heart he tried to hide beneath gruff words. James had loved him, even when he didn't understand him. And William's decision to leave everything to Clara instead of his nephew had stung, not because James needed the money, but because it felt like a rejection. Now, watching Clara carry water to the cows with a bucket that was too heavy for her frame, James began to understand. William hadn't married Clara for companionship in his final years. He'd married her to save her, and whatever money he'd left was meant to be her salvation, except the world had other plans. That evening, Clara made johnny cakes and weak tea for supper. She served James first again, her portion even smaller than the night before. He wanted to object, to tell her to take more, but he knew it would embarrass her. So he ate slowly, trying to make the meal last, and watched as she stared out the window at the darkening sky. "Storm's coming," Clara said quietly. "Can smell it on the wind." James followed her gaze. The horizon was indeed darkening, clouds piling up like mountains in the distance. "How long you think we have?" "Maybe a day, maybe less." Clara wrapped her hands around her teacup, seeking its meager warmth. "I need to get the wood moved closer to the house before it hits. Can't afford to dig through snowdrifts every time I need to feed the stove." "I'll handle it first thing tomorrow," James said. Clara shook her head. "I'll help. It's too much for one person, even a strong back like yours." They worked together the next morning in a race against the approaching storm. The sky had turned the color of old iron, and the wind carried the sharp bite of snow that hadn't fallen yet. James hauled the larger logs while Clara stacked them against the house, building a wall of wood that would serve as both fuel and windbreak. They didn't talk much, but James found himself acutely aware of her presence. The way she moved with efficient purpose, never wasting motion. The way she'd pause occasionally to stretch her back, one hand pressed to her spine. The way she looked at the sky with the wariness of someone who'd learned that nature gave no second chances. By midday, the first snowflakes began to fall, light and lazy at first, then faster and thicker. Clara straightened from her work and wiped sweat from her forehead despite the cold. "That's going to have to be enough," she said. "Storm's here." They barely made it inside before the wind picked up in earnest. James stood at the window, watching as the world disappeared behind a white curtain. The temperature inside the house dropped steadily, and Clara moved through the small space checking windows, stuffing rags into gaps, doing everything she could to keep the cold at bay. "You should stay in the house tonight," Clara said without looking at him. "Shed won't hold heat in this. You'll freeze." James started to protest, but Clara cut him off with a look. I'm not burying a drifter come morning because pride killed him. You'll sleep by the stove. I've got my room. That's final. The storm howled through the night like something alive and angry. James lay on blankets near the stove, listening to the wind tear at the house and wondering how Clara had survived previous winters alone. Every gust seemed determined to find a way inside, and even with the stove burning, the cold crept along the floor like water. Sometime deep in the night, James heard a sound that didn't belong to the storm. A soft, muffled noise coming from Clara's room. He lay still, listening. There it was again, the unmistakable sound of someone crying, trying desperately to stay quiet. James stared at the ceiling and felt something crack open in his chest. He thought about his own warm house, his comfortable bed, the staff who kept fires burning in every room. He thought about the money sitting in his bank account, more than he could spend in 3 lifetimes. And he thought about the woman crying in the next room, who'd married his uncle seeking safety and instead found herself trapped in a slow-motion catastrophe. When morning came, the storm had settled into a steady assault. Snow piled against the windows, and the wind hadn't lost any of its fury. Clara emerged from her room with her hair braided tight and her face composed, giving no sign of the tears James had heard in the dark. "Coffee's low," she said, measuring precious grounds into the pot. "We'll have to make it weak." They spent the day trapped inside, the storm making it impossible to go even as far as the barn. Clara mended clothes with thread so thin James could barely see it. He carved wooden pegs to replace nails, trying to be useful. The silence between them grew comfortable, broken only by the howl of wind and the crackle of the fire. "Can I ask you something?" Clara said suddenly, her needle pausing mid-stitch. "Of course." "Why are you really here, Jim Cooper?" She looked at him directly now, and James felt his heart stutter. "And don't tell me you're just a drifter looking for work. I've met plenty of drifters. You're not one of them." James felt the lie ready on his tongue, but looking into Clara's eyes, tired and knowing and done with deception, he couldn't force it out. "What makes you say that?" "The way you work, the way you talk, the way you hold yourself when you forget to slouch." Clara set down her mending. "You're educated, you're used to having money, and your hands were soft when you got here, even if they're blistered now." The truth sat in James's throat like a stone. He wanted to tell her everything, who he was, why he'd come, how wrong he'd been about her. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, he said, "I needed to understand something, about a person I thought I knew." Clara nodded slowly, as if that answer made a kind of sense. "And did you understand?" "I'm starting to." They said nothing more about it, but something had shifted between them. Clara seemed to relax slightly, and James felt the weight of his deception grow heavier with each passing hour. The storm lasted 3 days. 3 days trapped in the small house, rationing food that was already scarce, burning wood and wondering if it would be enough. On the 2nd day, Clara made soup so thin James could see through it. On the 3rd day, she made nothing at all, claiming she wasn't hungry even as her hands trembled with weakness. James watched her fade and felt rage building in his chest, rage at himself, at the circumstances, at his uncle for not leaving her better protected. When the storm finally broke on the 4th morning, he stepped outside into a world transformed by snow and made a decision. "I need to go into town," he announced when he came back inside. Clara looked up from the stove where she was nursing the last of their coffee. "Town's a full day's walk from here, and the snow's deep. You'll never make it there and back before dark." "I'll make it," James said firmly. "We need supplies, food, kerosene, medicine. I've got some money saved. Not much, but enough to get us through the rest of winter." "Jim, I can't ask you to." "You're not asking, I'm offering." James pulled on his coat, avoiding her eyes. "I'll be back tomorrow. Keep the fire going." He left before she could argue further, trudging through snow that came up past his knees in places. The walk to town was brutal, but James barely felt it. His mind was too busy planning, calculating, trying to figure out how to help Clara without revealing who he was. The town was small and half-deserted, most folks having enough sense to stay inside after the storm. James made his way to the general store where the owner, a thin man with suspicious eyes, was sweeping snow from his porch. "Help you?" the man asked. "Need supplies," James said. "Food, kerosene, whatever you can spare. I'm working out at the Hastings place." The store owner's expression soured. The widow, she got money to pay for supplies. "I've got money." The man leaned on his broom. "That woman's got debts all over town. William Hastings ran up bills before he died, and she inherited them along with that worthless property. She shows her face here. I'm keeping whatever she tries to buy until her account's settled." James felt his jaw clench. "How much does she owe?" "Total, between my store and the feed lot and the doctor, probably close to $300. $300. It was nothing to James Ashford. It was everything to Jim Cooper the drifter. He stood there in the snow, feeling the weight of his two identities pulling him in different directions. "I can pay $50 now," James said carefully, "toward her debt, and I'll take whatever supplies that buys, plus I'll work off the rest. You need anything done, I'm good with repairs, hauling, whatever you need." The store owner studied him for a long moment. "You sweet on the widow." "I work for her, she's been fair to me. I'm returning the favor." Something in James's tone must have been convincing, because the man nodded slowly. "All right, $50 pays off her account here and gets you a decent load of supplies. But you tell her the feedlot still expects payment, and Doc Morrison won't see her again until his bill's settled." James paid with money from his own wallet, watching as the store owner packed flour, beans, salt pork, coffee, and kerosene. It was more than Clara had probably seen in months, and it was barely a dent in what she needed. The walk back was even harder with the heavy pack, but James pushed through, arriving at Clara's house just as the sun was setting. He found her outside, chopping wood with movements that were more desperation than technique. She stopped when she saw him, the axe falling to her side. Her eyes went to the pack, then to his face. "Jim, what did you do?" "Got us through winter," he said simply, shouldering past her into the house. He set the pack on the table and began unpacking. Clara stood in the doorway, staring. "This is too much. This had to cost." "Don't worry about it. I can't accept this. I can't pay you back." James turned to face her, and the words came out harsher than he intended. "Then don't. Consider it payment for room and board. Consider it charity. Consider it whatever you need to consider it, but we're not having this argument. You're going to take these supplies, and you're going to eat actual meals, and you're going to stop trying to carry everything alone." Clara's eyes were bright with tears she refused to let fall. "Why are you doing this?" "Because I'm rich enough to buy this entire town, and I've been playing dress-up while you starve," James thought. "Because my uncle loved you and I failed to understand why. Because watching you suffer while I have everything has become unbearable." "Because it's the right thing to do," he said instead. That night they had the first real meal in days. Clara cooked beans and salt pork, and they ate until they were actually full. James watched color return to her cheeks and felt something warm and painful expand in his chest. Later, as he lay by the stove, he heard Clara's door open. She stood in the doorway in her nightgown, backlit by moonlight coming through her window. "Jim," she said softly, "thank you for everything. I know you're not who you're pretending to be, and I don't care. Whatever your reasons for being here, you've been kind when you didn't have to be. That matters more than any truth you're hiding." She went back to her room before James could respond, leaving him staring at the ceiling and wondering how everything had gotten so complicated. He'd come here to expose a fraud, and instead found the most genuine person he'd ever met. He'd come here to protect his family's fortune, and instead found himself wanting to give it all away just to see Clara smile without worry behind it. Morning came too soon, and with it, a realization that terrified James more than he wanted to admit. He was falling for Clara Hastings, not as Jim Cooper the drifter, but as himself, James Ashford, the man who'd been too blind to see what his uncle had seen immediately. And he had absolutely no idea what to do about it. The days that followed took on a rhythm that felt dangerous in its comfort. James woke before dawn and worked until his body ached, repairing fences, tending the cows, fixing everything that had broken during Clara's months of struggling alone. Clara cooked meals that were still modest but no longer desperate, and in the evenings they sat by the fire and talked about everything except the truth. She told him about growing up in a mining camp, how her father had died in a collapse when she was 12, and her mother had worked herself to death in a laundry by the time Clara was 16. She told him about the years she'd spent as a seamstress, saving every penny, dreaming of something more stable than rented rooms and borrowed dresses. She told him about meeting William at the general store, how he'd been kind when kindness was rare, how he'd offered her not romance but partnership, a chance to build something together in whatever time he had left. "I knew he was older," Clara said one evening, staring into the fire. "I knew people would talk, would assume things, but William never treated me like I was something he'd bought. He treated me like I was capable, like I mattered beyond what I could give him." She glanced at James. "That's rarer than you'd think." James felt each word like a knife. His uncle had seen Clara's worth immediately, had given her respect and dignity along with his name. And James had come here assuming she was a schemer, a woman who'd manipulated a lonely old man. The shame of it sat heavy in his gut. "He sounds like a good man," James said quietly. "He was," Clara's smile was sad. "And I failed him. All he wanted was for me to be secure after he was gone, and I couldn't even manage that. The debts, the repairs, everything falling apart. William would be disappointed." "No," James said firmly. "He'd be proud. You've kept this place standing against impossible odds. That takes more strength than most people have." Clara looked at him then, really looked at him, and James felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with his disguise. "You're a strange man, Jim Cooper. Every time I think I've figured you out, you say something that makes me wonder all over again." Before James could respond, a sound outside made them both freeze. Hoofbeats coming fast. Clara was on her feet immediately, moving to the window. James joined her, his hand instinctively going to the knife at his belt. 3 riders appeared out of the darkness, pulling up short in front of the house. James recognized the type immediately. Ranch hands, probably, but the kind who hired out for less respectable work when the money was right. The lead rider dismounted and knocked on the door, though it was less a request than a demand. Clara opened the door just wide enough to be seen. "Can I help you?" The man smiled, but there was nothing friendly in it. "Mrs. Hastings, I'm here on behalf of Mr. Richard Sutter. You know that name?" Clara's face went pale. "I know it." "Good. Then you know Mr. Sutter holds the note on this property. Payment was due 2 weeks ago. Mr. Sutter's been patient, but his patience has limits." "I asked for an extension," Clara said, her voice steady despite the fear James could see in her eyes. "Until spring. I explained the situation." "Mr. Sutter don't care about situations. He cares about money." The man leaned against the doorframe. "You got his payment or you got a problem." James stepped into view behind Clara. "The lady said she needs until spring. Seems reasonable to me." The man's eyes moved to James, assessing. "And who are you?" "Hired hand." "Hired hand." The man's smile widened. "Widow can't pay her debts, but she can afford to hire help. That's interesting." "I work for room and board," James said evenly. "And the lady's situation is temporary. Come spring, she'll have your payment." "Come spring, the property won't be worth collecting on." The man straightened. Mr. Sutter's been more than fair. He's willing to take the property off her hands right now, clear the debt, and give Mrs. Hastings here enough to start fresh somewhere else. That's generous." "That's theft," James said, his voice hardening. "This land's worth 5 times what she owes." "Land's worth what someone's willing to pay, and right now Mr. Sutter's the only one buying." The man tipped his hat to Clara. "You got 1 week, Mrs. Hastings. Come up with the money or accept Mr. Sutter's offer. Those are your options." He mounted his horse, and the 3 riders disappeared back into the night, leaving Clara and James standing in the doorway. Clara's hands were shaking, and when she turned away from the door, James saw tears streaming down her face that she didn't bother to hide anymore. "How much?" James asked quietly. $200. Clara's laugh was broken. "Might as well be 2,000. I don't have it. I'll never have it." James felt rage burning through him. Rage at Richard Sutter, whoever he was, for preying on a widow's desperation. Rage at the system that let men like that operate. Rage at himself for playing games while Clara's life crumbled around her. "There has to be a way," James said. "There isn't." Clara wiped her face roughly. "I've looked at this from every angle for months. I can sell everything. The cows, the tools, everything I own, and I might get $50, maybe. That leaves me $150 short and no way to earn it before the week is up." "What about family, friends?" "I told you, there's no one." Clara moved to the table and sank into a chair. "William had a nephew, James Ashford, owns the biggest ranch in the territory. William left him some things, personal items, a few head of cattle. I wrote to him after William died, told him he could collect his inheritance whenever he wanted." She laughed bitterly. "He never even responded. Too busy with his empire to care about his uncle's widow, I suppose." James felt like he'd been punched. She'd reached out to him. She'd tried to connect with William's family, and he'd ignored her letter completely. His lawyer had probably intercepted it, kept it from him as part of building the case against her character. And James had been too willing to believe the worst to question it. "Maybe he never got the letter," James said weakly. "Maybe, or maybe he just didn't care." Clara looked up at him, her face exhausted. "It doesn't matter now. What matters is I've got 1 week to come up with money I don't have, or I lose everything. The house, the land, every bit of security William tried to give me." James wanted to tell her right then. Wanted to reveal who he was, write her a check, make all of this go away. But the words stuck in his throat, tangled up with shame and fear. If he told her now, she'd know everything had been a lie. She'd know he'd come here to test her, to judge her, to find reasons to take away what little she had. And she'd hate him for it. He'd lose whatever trust they'd built, and the thought of that was suddenly unbearable. "Let me think," James said instead. "There's got to be something we can do." That night James barely slept. He lay by the stove, mind racing through possibilities. He could ride to his ranch, get the money, bring it back claiming he'd borrowed it. But Clara would ask questions, would want to know who'd lend a drifter $200. He could reveal himself, face her anger, and deal with the consequences. But that would destroy her trust in him, and possibly make her too proud to accept help. Or he could find another way. A way that didn't involve either his money or his lies. By morning, James had the beginnings of a plan. It was risky and would require help, but it was better than the alternatives. After breakfast, he told Clara he needed to go into town. "What for?" she asked, immediately suspicious. "To talk to some people, see if we can find a solution to your Sutter problem." "Jim, there's no solution. I told you." "Just trust me, please." James grabbed his coat. "I'll be back before dark." The ride to town was cold and long, but James pushed hard. He went first to the general store, where the owner was sweeping his front step. "Need another favor," James said without preamble. The store owner looked up wary. "What kind of favor?" "Information. Tell me about Richard Sutter." The man's expression darkened. "Sutter's a vulture. Buys up properties from desperate folks for pennies on the dollar, then sells them for huge profits. He's done it a dozen times in the last few years, waits for someone to hit hard times, offers them a note with impossible terms, then sweeps in to collect when they can't pay. That legal? Unfortunately, immoral as hell but legal. The store owner leaned on his broom. Why you asking? He's after the Hastings place. Of course he is. That property borders his land. He's been trying to get his hands on it for years. William wouldn't sell, but now that the widow's vulnerable, the man shook his head. Nothing you can do about it, son. Sutter's got lawyers and money. He always wins. James felt determination harden in his chest. Maybe not always. Where can I find him? The store owner gave him directions to Sutter's ranch, then added, You planning something stupid? Probably, James admitted. Richard Sutter's ranch was everything Clara's wasn't. Sprawling, well-maintained, dripping with the kind of wealth that came from taking rather than building. James rode up to the main house and dismounted, ignoring the suspicious looks from ranch hands working nearby. A butler answered his knock, looking down his nose at James's worn clothes. Deliveries around back. I'm here to see Mr. Sutter. Tell him it's about the Hastings property. The butler's expression shifted slightly. Wait here. James waited on the porch for 10 minutes before being led inside to a study that reeked of expensive whiskey and self-importance. Richard Sutter sat behind a massive desk, a man in his 50s with soft hands and calculating eyes. You're the widow's hired man, Sutter said without preamble. My men mentioned you. That's right. And you're here to beg for more time. Save your breath. Business is business, and Mrs. Hastings's business is overdue. James forced himself to remain calm. I'm here to make you an offer. That got Sutter's attention. He leaned back in his chair, amused. An offer, you? The Hastings property is worth at least $1,000, probably more. You know it, I know it. You're trying to steal it for $200. I'm collecting a debt. You're preying on a widow. James stepped closer to the desk. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to extend Mrs. Hastings's note for 6 months. In that time, I'll personally guarantee the property produces enough to cover what she owes plus interest. Fair interest, not the robbery you're currently charging. Sutter laughed. And why would I agree to that? Because if you don't, I'll make sure every newspaper in the territory knows exactly how you do business. I'll make sure everyone knows Richard Sutter's fortune is built on widows and orphans. I'll make you so toxic that even your crooked friends won't want to be seen with you. The amusement drained from Sutter's face. You threatening me, boy? I'm offering you a choice. Take a fair profit 6 months from now, or take the damage to your reputation right now. Sutter stared at him for a long moment, and James could see the calculation happening behind those cold eyes. Finally, the older man pulled out a piece of paper and scrawled something on it. Fine, 6 months extension, but the interest stays the same, and if she defaults again, I take everything. No more extensions, no more negotiations. Sutter slid the paper across the desk. And you better deliver on that guarantee or I'll make sure you regret it. James took the paper, fighting to keep his hands from shaking. We'll have your money. He left Sutter's ranch feeling both triumphant and terrified. He'd bought Clara time, but he'd also put himself on the hook for $200 plus interest. Money he had plenty of as James Ashford, but that Jim Cooper the drifter theoretically didn't have it all. The sun was setting by the time James made it back to Clara's house. She was on the porch, pacing, and relief flooded her face when she saw him. Where have you been? I was worried. James dismounted and handed her the paper. 6 months extension. Sutter agreed to it. Clara stared at the paper, then at him, then back at the paper. How? What did you do? Convinced him it was in his best interest. James couldn't quite meet her eyes. We've got 6 months to come up with the money, Clara. That's enough time to make this work. But how? The property barely produces enough to keep us fed, let alone. We'll figure it out. James finally looked at her, seeing hope and fear warring in her expression. Together, I'm not going anywhere. Clara's eyes filled with tears. She threw her arms around him suddenly, and James froze for a moment before returning the embrace. She felt small and strong and terrified, and James held her while she cried into his shoulder, wondering how he'd fallen so completely for a woman who didn't even know his real name. When she finally pulled back, wiping her eyes, Clara managed a shaky smile. I don't know how you did this, Jim Cooper, but thank you. Thank you for not giving up on me when everyone else has. James felt the lie between them like a physical weight. Clara, there's something I need to tell you. Not tonight, she interrupted softly. Whatever secrets you're carrying, they can wait. Tonight, let's just be grateful we have more time. So James swallowed his confession and followed her inside, where they celebrated their small victory with the last of the coffee and something that almost felt like hope. But in the back of his mind, James knew the clock was ticking. 6 months to save Clara's property. 6 months before she discovered who he really was. 6 months to figure out how to make this right without losing the only thing that mattered anymore, her trust. Winter began its slow retreat, though spring hadn't quite found the courage to arrive. The snow melted in patches, leaving the ground muddy and treacherous, but there was warmth in the sun when it bothered to show itself. James worked from dawn until well past dark, driven by a desperation that had nothing to do with the deadline hanging over them and everything to do with the woman who hummed while she cooked breakfast, who smiled more often now, who'd stopped looking at the horizon like she was waiting for the next disaster. They developed a plan, though calling it a plan was generous. Clara would expand her garden come spring, grow enough vegetables to sell in town. James would repair the fences properly and buy a few more head of cattle, an investment he'd quietly funded with his own money, claiming he'd won it in a card game. They'd take on any work they could find from neighboring properties. It was desperate and exhausting and probably wouldn't be enough, but it was something. What James hadn't planned for was how comfortable the lie would become, how easy it was to be Jim Cooper, the drifter who'd found a home, how right it felt to wake up in Clara's house, to share meals across her table, to fall asleep listening to her move quietly in the next room. He'd stopped thinking about his ranch, about his responsibilities, about the life he'd left behind. That life felt distant now, like it belonged to someone else. But reality had a way of catching up. It was a Tuesday morning when everything started to unravel. James was in the barn, mucking out stalls, when he heard a horse approaching. Not the aggressive arrival of Sutter's men, but the steady, purposeful gait of someone who knew exactly where they were going. James stepped out of the barn, shading his eyes against the morning sun, and felt his blood turn to ice. His ranch foreman, Tom Davies, sat astride a familiar bay gelding, his weathered face creased with concern. Tom's eyes widened when he saw James, taking in the worn clothes, the rough beard, the general appearance of a man who'd been living hard. "Mr. Ashford," Tom said, and his voice carried across the yard clear as a bell. "Thank God, we've been looking for you for weeks. When you didn't come back from your trip, we thought—" "Tom," James interrupted sharply, but it was too late. The damage was done. Clara had emerged from the house at the sound of the horse. She stood on the porch, a dish towel in her hands, and James watched her face as she processed what Tom had just said. Watched confusion become understanding, understanding become betrayal. "Mr. Ashford," Clara repeated, her voice very quiet. She looked at James, really looked at him, and he saw the exact moment she put it together. James Ashford, William's nephew. James felt the ground shift beneath him. "Clara, let me explain. You've been here for weeks." Clara's voice was still quiet, but there was something breaking underneath it. "You've been living in my house, eating my food, listening to me talk about my life, about my struggles, about—" She stopped, pressing her hand to her mouth. "About you, about how William's nephew never even cared enough to respond to my letter. I never got your letter, James said quickly, desperately. My lawyer, he kept it from me. He told me you'd married William for money, that you were living off the inheritance while pretending to be poor. I came here to see if it was true, and I found. You found what? Clara's voice rose now, anger burning through the hurt. You found me starving, struggling, and you decided to play dress-up and watch me humiliate myself. Watch me accept charity from a man I thought was as poor as me. No, that's not. Then what? Clara descended the porch steps, and James had never seen her look so fierce. What was the plan, Mr. Ashford? Let me grovel a little longer, see how desperate I could get. Were you testing me? Seeing if I'd try to seduce you for money? Seeing if I'd prove whatever terrible things your lawyer said about me? Tom Davies had gone very still on his horse, clearly wishing he was anywhere else. James ignored him, focusing entirely on Clara. At first, yes, James admitted, and he saw her flinch. I came here believing the worst about you. But Clara, within a day, within hours, I knew I'd been wrong. Everything I was told, every assumption I made, it was all lies. And I wanted to tell you the truth, but I was afraid. Afraid of what? That I'd be angry you lied to me for weeks. That I'd be humiliated that I poured my heart out to a man who was pretending to be someone else. Clara's laugh was sharp and bitter. Well, congratulations, Mr. Ashford. You were right to be afraid. Clara, please. James took a step toward her, but she backed away like he was something dangerous. Don't come near me. Clara's eyes were bright with unshed tears. All this time you let me believe you were someone I could trust, someone who understood what it meant to have nothing, and you were just, what? Slumming, playing at poverty while knowing you could leave whenever you wanted. It wasn't like that. Then what was it like? Clara demanded. Explain to me how lying to me every single day for weeks was somehow noble. Explain how watching me cry about losing everything, watching me ration food, watching me terrified about my future, explain how that was anything other than cruel. James had no answer that wouldn't sound like an excuse. Tom Davies cleared his throat uncomfortably. Mr. Ashford, sir, I should mention, there's been trouble at the ranch. That's why we've been looking for you. The spring contracts need your signature, and there's a dispute with the Farrell property line that requires your attention. Mr. Henderson's been handling things, but— Not now, Tom, James said without taking his eyes off Clara. But sir, it's been weeks, the ranch. I said not now. Tom fell silent, and in that silence Clara seemed to grow very still. When she spoke again, her voice was cold and controlled. You should go, Mr. Ashford. Your empire needs you. Thank you for the charity. I'll find a way to repay every cent you spent here, though I imagine it was pocket change for someone like you. She turned toward the house, then paused. And thank you for the 6 months extension with Sutter. I assume that was you pulling strings behind the scenes, using your money and influence. I'll figure out how to save this place without your help. Clara, wait. She went inside and shut the door firmly behind her. Not a slam. That would have been easier somehow. Just a quiet, final closing that said more than any amount of yelling could have. James stood in the yard, feeling like something vital had been torn out of his chest. Tom Davies shifted uncomfortably on his horse. Sir, I'm sorry, I didn't know. It's not your fault, Tom. James ran his hand through his hair, trying to think through the panic clawing at his throat. How bad is it at the ranch? Bad enough that we needed to find you. But sir, if you want to stay and sort this out. There's nothing to sort out. James looked at the closed door, willing it to open, willing Clara to give him a chance to make this right. She won't listen to me now, maybe not ever. He turned to Tom. Give me an hour to gather my things, then we'll head back. Tom nodded and rode toward the barn to water his horse, leaving James alone in the yard. He stood there for a long moment, staring at the house he'd come to think of as home, then forced himself to move. Inside the shed where he'd first slept, James gathered his few belongings. The borrowed clothes he'd worn, the tools he'd used, all of it felt contaminated now by his deception. He changed into his own clothes, the ones he'd hidden away weeks ago, and felt like he was putting on a costume. James Ashford the cattle baron felt less real than Jim Cooper the drifter. He approached the house one more time, knocked softly on the door. "Clara, I'm leaving, but I want you to know everything I felt, everything we talked about that was real. The lies were about who I was, not how I felt." No answer came from inside. James waited, hoping, but the silence stretched on until he had no choice but to turn away. The ride back to his ranch felt longer than any journey James had ever taken. Tom tried to make conversation at first, updating him on ranch business, but eventually gave up when James couldn't manage more than one-word responses. They rode through the afternoon and into the evening, finally reaching the Ashford ranch well after dark. The house blazed with light, a sprawling two-story affair that suddenly seemed obscenely large compared to Clara's tiny cabin. James dismounted, handed his horse to a waiting stable hand, and walked inside like a man heading to his own execution. His housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, nearly dropped her tray when she saw him. "Mr. Ashford, thank heavens, we've been so worried. Let me draw you a bath and prepare supper." "Just the bath, thank you, Mrs. Chen. I'm not hungry." He soaked in hot water that should have been luxurious after weeks of cold water washing, but felt wrong somehow. Everything here felt wrong, too soft, too warm, too easy. James closed his eyes and saw Clara's face. The moment understanding had dawned, the way betrayal had transformed her features. The next morning, James forced himself to deal with the ranch business that had piled up in his absence. Contracts to review, disputes to settle, decisions to make. He moved through it mechanically, his mind miles away in a small cabin where a woman was probably trying to figure out how to survive without the help she'd been counting on. 3 days passed in a blur of paperwork and meetings. On the 4th day, James's lawyer, Edward Morrison, arrived unannounced. "James, good to see you back," Morrison said, settling into a chair in James's study. "Where have you been? Your foreman said something about investigating the widow Hastings." James felt anger flare, hot and immediate. "You kept her letter from me." Morrison had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. "I thought it best. You lied to me about her character. You told me she was living lavishly off William's money when she was barely surviving. I was protecting your interests." "My interests?" James stood abruptly. "My interests were in knowing the truth about the woman my uncle loved enough to leave everything to. Instead, you fed me lies because you wanted to contest the will." Morrison's expression hardened. "Your uncle left a substantial estate to a woman he barely knew, while you, his own blood, received nearly nothing. That's not right, James. You have every legal ground to challenge." "I have no intention of challenging anything." James's voice was ice. "William's will stands exactly as he wrote it. Clara Hastings is entitled to every penny he left her." "But James, think about what you're saying. That money is hers. And you're fired, Morrison. I want you out of this house and off my property within the hour." Morrison stood, his face flushed with anger. "You're making a mistake. You're thinking with your heart instead of your head, and it's going to cost you." "Then it costs me. Get out." After Morrison left, James sat alone in his study and tried to figure out what to do next. He'd fired his lawyer, defended Clara's inheritance, but none of that changed the fundamental problem. She wouldn't accept help from him now, and he couldn't blame her. He destroyed her trust completely. But there had to be a way to make this right. Had to be something he could do that didn't involve her knowing he was behind it. James spent the next week quietly pulling strings. He couldn't approach Clara directly, but he could work from the shadows. He arranged for the feed store to forgive her remaining debt, claiming an anonymous benefactor. He had lumber delivered to her property, marked as being misdirected and hers to keep. He even managed to get the territorial governor to approve a small widow's relief fund that Clara would be eligible for. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough to make up for what he'd done, but it was something. 10 days after leaving Clara's property, James received a visit from the sheriff of the nearby town. The man sat in James's study, hat in his hands, looking uncomfortable. "Mr. Ashford, I need to ask you about Mrs. Clara Hastings." James's heart stuttered. "What about her? Is she all right?" "She's fine physically, but there's been an incident." The sheriff shifted in his chair. "Richard Sutter filed a complaint. Says Mrs. Hastings threatened him, showed up at his property making accusations about his business practices. He wants her arrested for harassment and trespassing." James felt cold fury wash through him. "When did this happen?" "3 days ago. I've been putting Sutter off, but he's insistent. Says if I don't bring her in, he'll go to the territorial marshal." "Sutter's a predator," James said flatly. "He preys on desperate people. Whatever Clara said to him, he probably deserved worse." "Maybe so, but that don't change the law." The sheriff looked genuinely troubled. "I like Mrs. Hastings. She's good people, but Sutter's got lawyers and influence, and I can't just ignore his complaint." James made a decision. What if Sutter withdrew his complaint? Then I'd have no cause to arrest her, but why would Sutter? "Let me handle Sutter. You give me 2 days before you do anything official." The sheriff studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "2 days, Mr. Ashford. Then I got to do my job." After the sheriff left, James called for his horse and rode straight to Sutter's ranch. He didn't bother with niceties this time, pushing past the butler and into Sutter's study without waiting to be announced. "Ashford," Sutter said, surprised. "I didn't realize you and the widow were acquainted." "Drop the complaint," James said without preamble. Sutter smiled. "Why would I do that? The woman came onto my property, made wild accusations." "Because if you don't, I will personally ensure that every banker, every investor, every business associate you have knows exactly how you operate. I'll buy up every note you hold and forgive them all. I'll make sure you can't prey on another desperate person in this territory." Sutter's smile faded. "You don't have that kind of power." "Try me." James leaned on the desk. "I'm James Ashford. My ranch is the biggest in 3 territories. My family name opens doors yours never will, and I will dedicate every resource I have to destroying you if you pursue this complaint against Clara Hastings." For a long moment, neither man moved. Then Sutter reached for a piece of paper, scrawled something on it, and shoved it across the desk. "Complaint withdrawn, but Ashford, you're making enemies you don't need." "I can live with that." James took the paper and left, feeling grimly satisfied. He rode back to Clara's property that afternoon, telling himself he just needed to make sure she was all right, that he wouldn't try to talk to her if she didn't want to see him. But when he arrived, he found the cabin dark and empty. The cows were in their pen, the chickens scratching in their yard, but Clara was nowhere to be found.